If you found your way to this video, you might have a suspicion that your child has ADHD. So what do you do next? Where do you go from here? If you're interested in finding out more answers about parenting ADHD effectively, please stay tuned. Hi everybody, welcome back to Project Happy Home. For those of you who are new here, I'm Tanya, a doctor, lawyer, turned homeschool mom of 3 kids ages 9, 6, and 4. My eldest has ADHD, and for the last couple of years I've done videos on just parenting ADHD, how we have managed to scaffold him as he grows, and how we've crafted an environment that encourages him in his personhood but also his academics. If you are interested in learning more about parenting ADHD effectively, this may be a good place to start. I plan to do a series this year on Parenting ADHD 101, starting from the very beginning in this video of what do you do when you first get that suspicion, that inkling that your child has ADHD, ranging all the way through topics about executive function, about appropriate testing, etc. So in this video, I just want to talk about what do you do at the very beginning, and I'll tell you a little bit about our experience as well. We first suspected that my son might have ADHD or learning difference of some kind when he was quite small, when he was in preschool, simply because he was very loud. He was very excitable. He loved to talk to everyone. He was super social. He didn't respond the way other children of his age were responding to gentle reprimands about sitting still in his seat or waiting his turn to speak, etc. And so preschool teachers had told us, he's very excitable, he's very energetic. No one ever really mentioned the word ADHD because legally, oftentimes, they are not allowed to. At home, he was an only child still at the age of 3, so he was very coddled in the sense of he had our attention when he wanted it. We had no other child to compare him to, so he just seemed like a very energetic little boy. When he went to kindergarten in the public school system, that was the first time that I noticed real differences between him and some of his classmates. One specific example where I noticed his difference was that his teacher had moved him to a table by himself for many of their sit-down activities simply because my son could not stop talking to his little table mates. And she explained to me, I kept moving him from table to table of quieter and quieter kids, but he kept making all the quiet kids social and talk. Which to me in my mom brain thought, that's a great thing. Like how wonderful that he's made them all engaged. But as somebody who used to teach, I can understand how that makes it difficult for the teacher to get through her lesson plan. So he was sitting at a table by himself, which I didn't really appreciate. The teacher also had a system where they would give out treasure box at the end of the week. And if you had had appropriate behavior for each day, you would get a tally mark. If you had 5 tally marks by Friday, you would get to pick something from the treasure box. I didn't even know treasure box existed until the middle of the year when my son informed me, I really wish I could get this thing that my friend has, but it's in treasure box and I'm never going to get treasure box, were his words. And that broke my heart. I thought, there's a reward system set up that my 6-year-old feels like he will never be able to attain. A 6-year-old should never be saying words like never. Like, I am just not that person now. They should not be so limited and defined at that age. And that really struck me hard. So when I discussed it with his teacher in the school, I brought up the words ADHD. I asked, what would the accommodations be if we continued in the school system, etc. Where we were living at the time, I wasn't satisfied with what those accommodations would be, and so I decided to go the homeschooling route. Now, before I actually made the decision to pull out our son from the schooling system and to try homeschooling, I wanted to have a definitive diagnosis, more for my own sake, so that I could direct my own research, so that I could help him the best way I was able. And we went through a full psychology evaluation, etc., which I'll get into another video. So that was our introduction into ADHD. It was definitely based on behavioral issues at school. Not so much academic, because my son just was a very early reader and very quick with academics, so it wasn't affecting him that way yet in the kindergarten level. Were there behavioral issues at home that we were also seeing? Yes and no. As I said, he was our eldest. We were not so well versed in parenting that we knew what children should look like and how they should behave. So some of the parenting issues that we had, we thought were just either on us, or this was just how a child was at the age of 2, 3, 4, and 5. However, his little sister now at this point was 2, 2.5, and she really was showing us that no, a lot of kids can listen better at 2 and 2.5 and can handle a lot more responsibility at that age, can sit quietly for certain things, can respond without having an extreme emotional response to reprimanding, etc. So we had this new child, to sort of compare our eldest to, and to realize that no, something else might be going on. This isn't just the average run-of-the-mill type of behavior. And those two aspects, the behavioral issues that were going on at school and some of the behavioral issues that were going on at home, led me to really want to have a definitive diagnosis with a psychology assessment, etc. So that was how our family landed in this ADHD world. The first thing I did was research everything I could to the ends of the internet about ADHD. Now, as a person who's done that, let me tell you, there's a lot of misinformation out there on the internet. The same way there is about almost anything. So there's a lot of agendas at play. There's lots of different opinions about medication versus not medication, versus brain training versus not, versus auditory assessments and eye assessments and that type of therapy versus not, a psychiatric evaluation versus a psychology evaluation, whether you should keep your child in school, whether you should homeschool. If you do keep your child in school, what are the appropriate accommodations? If you do decide to medicate, what are the appropriate medication regimens, etc., etc., etc. The opinions explode on the internet, and if you are watching this video, I imagine you've experienced some of that push and pull of different opinions yourself. Now, the facts on ADHD are pretty clear. They've been studied and evaluated for over 3 decades now. ADHD is not a new diagnosis, despite what a lot of more incendiary type of articles like to claim. One thing I'd like to say at the outset is that the idea that ADHD doesn't exist is 100% a myth. It exists. I say that not only as a mother who has seen my child actually exhibit symptoms that indicate a different type of brain wiring, but also as a medical professional. It exists. It has been clinically and scientifically observed and documented and everything. So that is not a debate at all. That is really worthy of getting into the weeds about. ADHD exists. Now, what is ADHD? It is a neurobiological disorder. It is characterized by a slow maturation of certain parts of the brain, especially the prefrontal cortex, as well as abnormal functioning of a lot of the neurotransmitters in the brain. Now, this has been documented and observed. ADHD is said to affect about 5 to 10% of school-age children in the United States, and that brings up another issue. Whether or not ADHD is overdiagnosed in this country is completely separate from whether or not ADHD exists. In this video, I'm not really going to address whether it's overdiagnosed, but I will say that it simply does exist. That is just proven. It exists, and if you as a mother or father can see changes in your child and struggles that your child may be experiencing that are different from the norm or from other children their age, you owe it to your child as well as yourselves as parents to explore that. Because if we do not address how our children's brains are actually working, we do them a disservice. We end up punishing them for things that are not in their control. We end up parenting in a very reactive way that doesn't leave us feeling good at the end of the day or them. And often, if we parent as though our children are neurotypical when they are not, no one achieves any progress. The children don't actually learn how to conform better to our household rules or society's rules, and we simply get more and more frustrated. So when I see people really denying the existence of ADHD and really pushing for like harsher discipline, and this is because you don't parent well enough, and etc., I really wonder at what their agenda is. What is the purpose of that? We can stamp out our children's little light and make them quiet and sit in a corner and not be a bother. Violence will do that. Harsh words will do that. Is that actually teaching them how to thrive? Is that actually making our families stronger? Is it improving our connection with our child? When you think back to your own childhood and you think about difficult moments that you had as a child and your parents' harsh response or confusing response, do you remember how jarring it was? Do you remember how it felt to be doing something wrong in innocence, like completely unknowing that something was socially unacceptable or that someone might be offended by this particular comment or phrasing, and just being punished for it or harshly, like verbally reprimanded for it, and just being confused and shocked a little bit at the violence of that reaction, but also not knowing how to improve because you didn't quite understand the basis of any of that. If you are a child who is atypically wired, particularly if you have ADHD, there are so many things that are harder for you in childhood because you are fundamentally not at your age maturity yet, at your chronological age maturity. Oftentimes, children with ADHD who are 9 will really have the emotional maturity and the social maturity of a 6-year-old. Imagine being 9 and just, punished for something that you don't physiologically understand yet. You didn't understand what was wrong about that behavior. You wouldn't reprimand a 2-year-old for certain social mishaps the way you would reprimand a 5-year-old. And if you don't realize that your child is atypically wired, that 5-year-old in front of you is still thinking a little bit like that 3-year-old self, you can't really address his behavior in the appropriate way. We can make our 3-year-olds behave better and realize what their actions should be in a certain situation, but we have to talk to them in a way that makes sense to that 3-year-old brain. When we have a child with ADHD and we have a 5-year-old or a 6-year-old who's behaving very immature, we need to talk to them in a way that makes sense to a slightly younger brain so that they can understand, so that they are not frightened, so they're not stressed as we try to improve their behavior to make it fit and meld more in our family culture and in our society's culture. So I hope that made sense. And to get to the point of this video, where do you go from here? 1, do your internet research, but take it all with a grain of salt. 2 really good websites to start that with are AttitudeMag.com, and I'll link these down below, as well as understood.org. Both those sites have a wealth of articles about the beginning of learning about ADHD, about the middle if you're trying to decide about medication versus not, about simple things like how to get your child to get through their homework better, how to make a child not lose every single thing in their backpack, or how to handle sibling fights better, especially when you have one child who's neurotypical and one child who's not. Both those sites, AttitudeMag.com and Understood.org, are wonderful places to start. There are many, many different authors that I would recommend as well, and I will address that in another video in this series. There's lots of podcasts out there now. The wealth of information about being a parent of a neuroatypical child is exploding, and I'm so grateful for that, and you should be as well. So gather the information you can, figure out what your own biases are, what have they been in the past, figure out who in your life really supports your child and sees them for who they are, who in your life does not. Decide, with family members especially, who to tell, who not to tell. One of the first real questions you have to address is, do I tell my child? Do I tell my child that they have ADHD? I really advocate for this approach because I feel that it helped my son so much to understand that some of his behaviors that didn't look like the behavior of his peers was because of his brain wiring. And some of his brain wiring creates great, amazing things like his incredible creativity, his ability to hyper focus on things that he's really interested in, to speed through materials if he's focused. All of that comes from that brain wiring also. There's positive traits and negative traits. The negative things we can work with. We can be in control of our thoughts, in control of our brain. The more we can be aware of what's happening up there, the more we can be in control of our lives. Telling your child that they have ADHD can really improve the quality of your discourse, the quality of what you're trying to do here, and how you're helping them. Because if you're trying to hide the ball and saying like, oh, we can do this, or oh, we can do that, it can really sort of hinder your progress. Tell them what wonderful things come from their atypical wiring. Tell them what challenges it brings as well. And then you can have an honest conversation about it. You can get books for them that are directed at their age group that talk about other children who may have ADHD, etc., how they work with it, how they've found different tricks and tips to help them. I feel like honesty in almost every aspect of life is the best policy, including this one. Of course, this is a choice that you have to make for yourself, but as a mom, in our personal experience, being honest with my son about his atypical wiring, about his beautiful mind, has been so helpful in helping him progress and do better. Because when we know better, we can do better, and we don't panic about our slight weaknesses or foibles or things that our brain just makes harder for us. We don't panic. You know, we can tell ourselves our thoughts are not everything we are. I'm here to calm you down, my beautiful brain. I'm on your team. I always tell my son, you know, be your own best friend. Don't ever beat yourself up for things that you cannot help, you know? Like, we can comfort ourselves. We can handle our thoughts. I want to give my children, both my son with ADHD and my more neurotypical daughters, but who knows what things might come, this ability to know that we are not just our thoughts. We are not just our brain wiring. We can soothe ourselves the way we would a pet or a small child. You know, to have compassion for yourself, we need to know how we are wired. So that's the second tip, is to let your child know what ADHD is, the good things and the bad things, and how we're going to work with this, how we're going to make the most wonderful outcomes for our child. The third question would be, do you want to get an official diagnosis or not? And how do you go about doing that? Again, internet research can tell you a lot about this. If you are in a public school system, often the school itself will help you out with a psychological assessment, etc., as well as accommodations for your child in school. If you're going the homeschool route, there's a whole new world of possibilities open to you. In this video series, I'll be talking about different methods of evaluation and how you might want to go about that and why. One of the considerations you have, obviously, about getting an official diagnosis is the cost of a psychological evaluation, which is not insignificant. So that's a whole nother piece of it. A fourth piece of it is just, where do we begin? What behaviors do we focus on? Do we focus on the academic side of things? Do we focus on the behavioral side of things? How do we address this? You know, with ADHD, there are so many different facets of how we can help scaffold our kids, but it gets very overwhelming if you try to like fix everything all at once. My advice is to really sort of chart out, what are the areas of your child's weaknesses? What are things that create issues in your home and in his school life, in his academic life? Is it the morning? Is it meal times? Is it getting out the door from the garage? Is it managing his backpack and his assignments? What is the most pressing concern? You know, like once you've made a list of these concerns, what is the most pressing thing? Is it disrespectful talk back? What is the thing that creates the most havoc in his life and your life, or her life and your life right then? And sort of order these by priority. When you start doing the research, don't just fall into the well and get overwhelmed. Sort of piece out one or two things. Talk to your child about that. What is bothering you the most? You know, like what makes school just really hard? Or what makes the morning so tough for you? You know, and you would be surprised. Your child will often have a very articulate answer that you missed completely. You didn't realize that, oh, it was just this simple matter of like having his clothes laid out, or the way he has to put back his toothbrush, and the fact that it's not out on the counter that makes him forget. Things like that. They might have really good suggestions that open your eyes to simple solutions for one thing at a time. So chart out your concerns, prioritize them, discuss with your child possible solutions, what's important to them, how they think they might fix it. Another question is executive function. What is executive function? Why should I care? Again, in this series, we will be talking about that. Briefly stated, executive function is this ability to understand that there needs to be a plan in place for like results to happen, so that when I get up in the morning, for us to leave the house on time, we need to brush our teeth, eat our breakfast, put our things in our backpack, and get out the door. That type of thinking. First this, then that, then this is part of the executive functioning umbrella. So understanding what executive functioning is and how best to scaffold the development of that executive functioning, the strengthening of it in our child, is a really important part of ADHD. Another issue is time blindness. Now, a lot of our kids simply don't understand what 5 minutes is. In 5 minutes, we're gonna leave. They don't understand that 5 minutes looks like this, that it looks like this amount of time. I often recommend the use of visual timers to help with that, so they actually can see the time shortening, you know? And I've had videos in the past on that. So if you look at my ADHD tips series, there's one just on timers, I believe. And that can be really, really useful to kids. When my kids brush their teeth, they use those simple sand timers that you can get from the Dollar Tree. Just this idea of like giving them a visual cue to time passing is really helpful. Giving them a lot of countdowns is really helpful. Again, this is something we'll talk about in the series in much more detail. Practically speaking, what does ADHD look like is a really big question, and it can vary from one child to another in huge extremes, right? If you've met one child with ADHD, you've met one child with ADHD. It does not look the same in different households. Part of that, I believe, is just because of one, genetics, two, the inherent temperament of the child and how it's playing on that. Their sibling relationships. Is this a child who's a middle child, a first child, a last child? I think that really affects how they've been parented, as well as how they come out in this world, how they show up at the dinner table, how they are with their siblings, how they are with you. With our son, for example, he was our first. He is our experimental child in almost every way. We get to do the first everything with him. The first teaching a child how to ride a bike. The first figuring out homework. The first figuring out, you know, are we going to do meal times together as a family? Are we not? When are we going to do bath time? How are we going to do bedtime? How are we going to have media restraints? Everything has been experimented on this child, and he happens to be atypically wired as well. That really affected his experience. When I think on it, if our third child had ADHD or has ADHD, her experience is going to be very, very different simply because we are different parents to her. So it will practically look different in every household. And when you do your internet research or listen to your podcast or read your books, I really emphasize that you should take it with that view as well. Whatever this author is saying who had one child, maybe an only child with ADHD, their experience is very different, vastly different from what yours may be. So when you read these resources, really take what you think will work, experiment with some of these things. Some of them might not work at all, and that is not because you're doing things wrong or because your child is somehow like just failing at like getting better or anything. It might just be that that tip doesn't work for your situation. So really have compassion for yourself and for your child during this process. A biggie, of course, is how to effectively treat ADHD. Beyond these little things that we can do like timers and charts and things like that, like what are the best supplements for ADHD? Like what type of diet should I be having? Should I medicate? Should I not medicate? If I take my child to therapy, what types of therapy should I be doing? These are all really big, vast questions, and I hope to address them in this video series this year. As I said before, I am a medical professional, but in no way am I a specialist in the area of ADHD beyond being a mother of a child with ADHD. So, as with anything I say on this channel, I would really advise you to do your own research, contact your own medical professionals before making any types of decisions about supplements, medication, therapy in particular, because you want to focus your efforts and your money and your time on your child and your child's particular needs. I don't know your child, nor does any author or podcast host. You really want to have medical professionals who know your child and know your family to give you that type of specific advice. But I will, in this video series, give like a broad overview of what the research shows, etc. And I hope that is helpful to you. The first thing I would recommend is to really do your research, to discuss it with your child, to establish sort of little plans for your family, like how can we best address this, to have a plan to talk to your physician about it, your child's pediatrician, really see next steps, talk to your child's teacher, etc. After that's all said and done though, the biggest overarching thing I can recommend in this initial stage is to have compassion for yourself, to have compassion for your kid. Grow your patience, seriously. Grow that muscle. Your patience with yourself when you freak out unreasonably, and your patience with your child. Think about the future as opposed to the immediate moment where something annoying is happening. Really. Think about how if in 1 year, will this matter to you at all? When you walk into your child's room and you see like that nothing has been picked up and you just told them to pick up their room, will you care about this moment in a year? And if you do not, take a breath and try to grow that patience and compassion when you speak to them. I promise you that the more respect you can show for your child and their atypical wiring, the more respect and attention they will give you in response. Because they probably already know, with or without a diagnosis, with or without a label, that somehow they are not behaving in the same way as their peers. Somehow they get in trouble more often. Somehow they're always saying or doing something that's a little bit atypical. They already have this awareness, I guarantee you. If they find that their mom or dad is now their ally, their teammate, their partner in exploring how their brain is wired, in figuring out their strengths, how this makes their brain stronger, and figuring out how to shore up some of those weaknesses, the amount of relief their little brains will have is immense. The best thing you can do right now is to have compassion, patience, and a little bit of humor, because this is a matter of accepting this diagnosis not just once, but over and over and over again. Because there will be many, many instances over the coming years where you just are frustrated and at your wit's end, and where you're embarrassed sometimes in front of other people, and where you're just disrespected and feeling so lonely in this place of parenting an atypically wired child. So grow your humor, your compassion, and your patience, not only for your child and your child's behavior, but also for your own. And I promise it will go a long way, because you will have to accept this atypical wiring over and over and over again, and forgive yourself and your kid over and over and over again. But be open to all the amazing things that the diagnosis can bring as well. So this is my very first video on Parenting ADHD 101, and I hope you will subscribe so you don't miss any more videos in the series. Often, my friend Danielle over at Danielle Gets It Done will be collaborating with me on this series because she has a younger child with ADHD, and she does a wonderful job in explaining her own experience as well as some of the things she's been finding that works for her. So as we grow together as parents of ADHD children, I hope you will join us and hit subscribe so you don't miss any more videos in the series. If you have particular questions or video topics that you'd like us to address, I would love it if you would mention them in the comments down below. You can always email me at contactprojecthappyhome@gmail.com if you wanted to talk more privately about any particular concerns or questions that you might have. I try my very best to address every single comment and every single email. Sometimes there will be a delay of a few weeks because I am a mom of 3 and I homeschool and I have a lot to do. I hope this has been helpful to you. Be sure to check out Danielle's video also. I'll link it down below and up above. And as always, I wish you guys the very best day.